This is the second part of 4.1, where you're going to hear a little bit more about the more complicated ways of creating a sample survey that includes stratified and cluster sampling, as well as some of the things that can happen in terms of bias or poor sampling and what problems that can create. So this particular one is going to talk a little bit more about stratified and a cluster sample, as well as what can go wrong with those, and then some of the other things that allude to bias. So sometimes a simple random sample is all we need, but sometimes we want to have a better idea of a representation of a large population or a population that might have some variations within it. So to get a stratified random sample, we're going to look at classifying the population into similar things and then taking a random sample from each of those strata. So very often the similar characteristics that might be looked at are gender, income, class in school. If we're talking about representation of a population of a high school, for example, cost of tickets, we're going to be looking at a basketball game and different things based on how expensive your tickets were. And then once you've done that, you're going to go ahead and choose to take a simple random sample from each of the ones. We're going to talk about it as it relates. Emojis. For example, we want to have eight total in our sample, but first we're going to break them into strata. So here we're going to have our happy face emojis and our unhappy emojis, and then from there we would assign each of those happy face emojis a number and have the random number generator or the table or whatever, or even slips of paper with the numbers on them, that would work. And you're going to choose 4 of them that are happy, and then you're going to do the same thing, number the unhappy emojis, and then choose 4 of them that are unhappy, and then from there you've got your stratified random sample. Here we have an example of a stratified random sample in the results. And so the stratas that were chosen were your alignment politically: conservative Republican, moderate Republican, liberal Democrat. I'm not going to communicate what this shows, but very often when they're looking at what people believe about things, they're going to break you up into where you live or your party affiliation or something like that. That's going to be an appropriate strata. And then very often they also break it up by gender. So a stratified random sample breaks things into stratas first. A cluster sample looks more almost geographically, you can think about it in terms of that. Then populations are loud and spread out over a wide area. Cluster sampling helps. To get a cluster sample, we're going to classify the population into groups of individuals that are located near each other, called clusters. And then we're going to do an SRS of each of those clusters. And so here's an example from so perhaps there is a group that's looking at whether your med school board scores are connected to whether you're going to the first choice school that you wanted to go to med school. And so they might choose to cluster it by geography. And so maybe it's like that, and maybe it's like that. And then from there's our clusters: Western states, Midwest, Eastern Seaboard in the South. And then from there, they're going to, within each of those clusters, in this case, they took a random sample of 1. So on the West Coast, UCFS was chosen, and Midwest, Kansas was chosen, and then Emory for the Eastern Seaboard in the South randomly. And then from there, everybody at UCSF would answer the survey, and everybody at Emory would answer the survey, and everyone at Kansas. So clustered sampling, once you get to a cluster being chosen, it's a census style. Okay? So the point of collecting information in the first place is to give us information about the larger population. So that sample, that smaller bit of the larger population, has to be chosen very well. Otherwise, the conclusions we draw from our sample really can't be used to make inferences about the larger population. So we rely on random sampling because this allows us to avoid bias that might come from selecting samples that are only from people that want to take part in the survey, or that it's convenient for the researcher to have, or something like that. And because random samples will follow the laws of probability, then we know, and we'll learn more about this in a couple of weeks, that random samples come with a predicted margin of error that sets boundaries on. We come up with a number of this is the average, but there's an upper bound and a lower bound, or what we can expect. 95% of the time is normally what our margin of error talks about, that we can expect it to be between above and below, and we'll talk more about that in a different video. And also larger random samples give better information about the population than smaller samples, but that comes with a kind of a diminishing return after a certain amount. We'll find out, for example, that Gallup and Pew tend to use 1,000 for the larger population, a sample of 1,000 for the larger population, because anything beyond that really doesn't give that much more information for the cost of increasing the size. So I'm just going to have you pause the video and write this information down, and then I'm going to explain each of them a little better. So undercoverage occurs when some members of the population cannot be chosen in a sample. So if we wanted a representative sample of the population of all students in Nevada High School, but we take our sample from 7th period, we're not going to get it because some students don't have 7th. And if we want a population of all the households in the U.S., but we only survey people by landline, we're not going to get homeless people, and we're not going to get people that only have cell phones, and we're not going to get people in prison and that kind of stuff. Dormitories either. So non-response is when an individual, whether it's a person or university or whatever the smallest unit from which we're collecting data, has been deemed part of the sample, but who chooses not to answer or can't be contacted. So for example, teachers recently were asked to take a survey about changing the schedule, and someone might choose not to answer it because they don't care, they're retiring, or the survey got sent to the junk mail folder. We were all part of who was supposed to answer the questions. In this case, it was a census, not a sample. But still, non-response would create perhaps some issues with getting clear information. Also, when I asked you how your weekend was the other day, there were some people on a field trip, and I didn't try to get their information. So that's a non-response. They were part of the sample, but they didn't get to or chose not to answer. That's different from voluntary response, where the only people that are allowed to answer are the people who choose to answer. So I'm not going to talk about this one at all. I'd like you to read here's the order of the questions, here is some wording and why you think that could be biased, and then the difference between an agree or disagree and a choice format. Read them and see how they can change or push someone in a certain direction. Bring your questions.